Let me get my eyes here. See distance, but I can't read. Can't say either. No, well, that too.
Nice.
It's my pleasure to introduce Glen Mitchell. And hi, Glen. Born and raised in Oklahoma, Glen graduated from the Oklahoma State University, where both his parents had attended school as music majors, and later his father was head of music department in that university. After graduation, Glen followed the musical path, playing in a band, which led him from Oklahoma to living in California and later on New York City. After starting a family, Glen returned to the Midwest, specifically in Texas, where he worked in a very successful family business. And that was the manufacture and sales of innovative air-powered drill bone surgery. A training program was developed whereby surgeons could handle the drill and practice in a laboratory environment rather than in a surgical theater. And being a patient, I'm glad they did that. As an instructor in this laboratory training, Glen worked with surgeons and operating staff around the world. It was in this environment that Glen met his wife, Carmel, from Windsor, when she attended one of his seminars as the head nurse of neurology at Henry Ford Hospital, Detroit. Glen and Carmel got married in Windsor and later moved to Windsor for Glen's son to attend high school. It was during this period that Glen was able to meet many in the Windsor community and hear stories from these friends. One of these stories is a children's book, A Bad Penny Always Comes Home. I'll pass this around. But this was not his only creative writing venture about Windsor. He also wrote a poem about the Dieppe raid in 1942, and I'll pass that around also. Of course, remember that the Essex Scottish were in that raid, and of 553 who went ashore, 51 returned to England that day. The rest were either killed or prisoner of war. Without further ado, please welcome Glen Mitchell, and I'll grab the screen so you can all see him in the screen. Thank you, Glen. Go ahead, Glen.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation to be here. Whenever John reached out, he reminded me of back in my high school days. I was selected by the Rotary Club in Stillwater, Oklahoma, where I grew up, to be a boy Rotarian for one of the meetings during my 11th grade year. So I've been aware of the Rotary Club for a long time. Certainly appreciate and understand all of the commitment you guys make to the civic improvement. And so it's really nice to be a part of it again by being here at this meeting. I'm going to share the screen here so I can get going with the presentation. And let's see if I can get it going here. Oh, I need that back. Share the screen. Oh, there it is down there at the bottom. All right. Well, several years ago, back in the mid 60s, the city of Windsor actually bought a Lancaster bomber, which is the story of what this book's about. And the bomber was actually set up in Jackson Park for many years until it was moved to the hangar out at the airport where it's undergoing restoration. And it's during this period of time, while I was in Jackson Park, that I heard the story from a gentleman named Mike Beale, who was the former president of what is now the Canadian Aviation Museum out at the airport. And he told me a story relating to a local person, Bob Upcott, who was a pilot during the latter stages of World War II. So he and being the captain of the plane got to choose his crew members. And so he picked out a crew of 7, 5 of which were from Ontario, 2 of which were from England. So this is a picture of the crew. Bob Upcott's the smiling guy in the back of I can't tell you, okay, on the left, there are the 2 Brits, and then there's Bob in the middle, and then there's the navigator, Bill Walton, on the right. So this was the Bad Penny crew. And they call it, most of the planes back then had their own nose art. So this was the nose art that would have been on the Bad Penny had they ever decided that they had enough time off that they could get it painted onto the Bad Penny. But they've renamed the Lancaster at the airport the Bad Penny in order to honor, Bob and all the other crew members. And this is a side note, Stan Jones, who was the British radio operator, he ultimately moved to Windsor and lived in Windsor for many years until he passed away in 2009. So having heard the story, I thought it would be a really terrific kids book, but it had to be an illustrated kids book. And after waiting for something to happen of it many years, I finally decided if I don't try to write it, nobody else will. So I was able to really come up with a opportunity to write the book and get it to some sort of position, where you could move forward with publications, which had all happened locally in Windsor using the Walkerville Press. So in order to really set up the whole story, you got to start with the beginning of World War II, which began in 1939 when the Nazis decided they needed to go into Poland. And when it ended in 1945, World War II, everybody in the world almost was either involved as a participant, either as a warring participant or a humanitarian, participant. So here's the invasion, or at least a picture of some sort of invasion of sorts. But Holland, which is also known as the Netherlands, it shares a common border with Germany on the eastern side. And though they were a neutral country, they were invaded in May of 1940. And this is a picture of Rotterdam. And the subsequent abuse that was imposed on the Dutch population is described best by this passage from the book called Holland and the Canadians. It says there are a few periods in the history of the Netherlands in which the tragic significance has been more deeply impressed on our hearts impressed in the hearts of our people than the German occupation lasting from 1940 to 1945. 5 days of stubborn resistance were followed by 5 years of occupation characterized by oppression and violence such as the country had not experienced since the 80 Years' War. Systematic looting and pillage and the carrying off of our men into shameful slavery have brought the country to the end of its endurance. And as one can ascertain from these words, this was not a pleasant time for the Dutch. In August of 1942, there was a daring but yet unsuccessful attempt made to invade the European continent through Dieppe, France. Though no one was liberated, the assault did provide the civilian populations with greatly needed positive morale that they were not forgotten. Sooner or later, an invasion would come. And the Essex Scottish Regiment locally, which is now the Essex Kent Scottish Regiment, was involved in this unsuccessful raid. And as Hardy just mentioned, many of the local community men were either lost or imprisoned. And this was a monument that was dedicated in their honor back several years ago. And this is on the beach in Dieppe, France. And if you ever have a chance to get there, go see it. But if you can't get there, there's a similar one in an exact replica copy in the Dieppe Park down in Windsor. So it's also a really wonderful place to go and visit. And I'm sure that they will be visiting that. I think is August 19th is the date whenever that raid was launched. But because of the unsuccessful raid, it allowed the D-Day invasion, which took place in 1944, to put Allied troops onto the shores of Europe. So they were pushing through once they got on board, and they started pushing in through France and through Belgium and into the Netherlands. And in 1944, there was an operation called Market Garden, which was supposed to be a huge paratroop invasion and then coupled with the advancing armies. But the in-exile government of the Netherlands called for a nationwide railway strike. So the Germans would be unable to successfully move supplies, personnel, or weapons within the country. But because the Operation Market Garden was also not thoroughly successful, it was quite predictable how the Germans would respond, which was very harsh. All the food and all supplies were stopped, and heating, gas, fuel, electricity, everything was pretty much cut off. And the winter of 1944 and 45 over there was extremely brutal and cold. You can tell by the depth of the snow. And by later recounted by a Red Cross delegate, the physical conditions of the Western provinces have reduced the inhabitants to a primitive state in the struggle for existence. Some eat flower bulbs. The bombed houses are pillaged and looted of all combustible material. The trees in the gardens are cut and carried away by night. And the daily caloric calorie intake of a Dutch person was only about 500 calories. This is called today over there, still they call it the hunger winter or the starvation winter. And in the early months of 1945, starvation had begun to grip the people in the Western provinces of the Netherlands. The severity of the situation was communicated to the Allied command by Quil Wilhelmina. And she says, quote, "Conditions have at present become so desperate that it is abundantly clear that if a major catastrophe is to be avoided in Holland, something drastic has to be done now, not after the liberation of the rest of the country." End of the quote. So Allied command decided the only way to approach the magnitude of the starvation was to attempt food drops into the Netherlands, targeting those areas most deeply affected. And the food being stored for prisoners of war was diverted and committed to the food drops for the suffering Dutch. And back in England, they started making practice runs with dummy food bands to determine what speed and altitude was needed for success. And slow and low was the answer. Go in slow, go in low. Bad Penny ultimately went in at 50 feet, which is shown on the upper right-hand corner when he talks. This is a log page of pilot Bob Epcott's logbook, where it says drop supplies to the Dutch at The Hague, 50 feet. So though apparent to the Allies the war would soon be over, the war was still in effect. So negotiations were begun between the warring parties in an effort to facilitate food drops. The Germans were reluctant to agree to this, but however, General Eisenhower, as the supreme Allied commander, ordered the drops to begin, no matter what any reaction would be. So the Allies declared a unilateral truce, which was communicated to the Germans. It would be in effect for 24 hours, starting on April 28th at 0800. And the mission was called Operation Manna. So Bad Penny was subsequently loaded with food, ready to fly, but bad winter weather prevented her from taking off. And the next day, April 29th, though still overcast in England, Bad Penny takes flight in the early morning. And as she starts heading towards Holland, the sky is clear, and it's safe to assume that Bob Epcott and the crew of the Bad Penny knew that they were in a guinea pig situation, because Bomber Command could well have been very foolish to commit their planes that were unprotected and unarmed to a full-scale effort without knowing the reaction of the Germans. So they sent these planes up. There's the Bad Penny plane. It was the Ontario and Bob Epcott group and one other Australian crew up into the air, just hoping that they could make it back. And the whole Operation Manna would hinge on whether they would be successful or not. So it takes all of the crew members to make a successful flight, because no one really sees everything all at the same time. So between all seven, they could tell what's pretty much is going on. But they are aware that the German artillery and anti-aircraft guns are tracking them and following them. And actually at the end of the flight, they did find one bullet hole in the plane. And though the food drops were still not really, it was still a state of war, the food drops were successful. But had they been attacked, legally, because it was a unilateral truce, there would have been a legitimate reason for them to attack. But it was successful. The food was able to be released and dropped, and the ground crews in England this is the British people on the crew, and Stan Jones on your left. He was the radio operator that radioed back the success of the mission. And here they go, they're loading more food, but because of the, whenever they got through dropping the foods and successful, the meeting back was broadcast all over the BBC. And the reason that this is important is because by the time this broadcast was done around noontime, Bab Penny was already back at her base and celebrating the fact that they made it over one more trip without having any loss of life or any loss of airplanes. So the BBC broadcasts this announcement, which says, bombers of the Royal Air Force have just taken off from their bases in England to drop food supplies to the Dutch population in enemy occupied territory. And so, like I said, by the time this broadcast was made, Bab Penny was back at her airfield. So hundreds of Dutch go outside to watch for the arrival of the Lancasters. They wave their flags, they wave bed sheets, hats, arms, anything at all to show their appreciation to the planes. And as the flights continue for the next 10 days, beyond the date of May 5th, 1945, which is called Liberation Day in the Netherlands, the crowds keep getting bigger and bigger as word of food being delivered by the planes drops among the Dutch. And in contrast, the Bab Penny, being the first plane, was not greeted at all. No one knew of her mission. No one came out to wave. She came in unannounced and unnoticed by everybody except Peter, a young boy in a field out looking for the food. So here's the book. Almost time to take off, said Pilot Bob to Bab Penny, his trusted airplane, a Lancaster bomber. We have volunteered for a special mission. Bab Penny had been on many missions during World War II, but had never volunteered for one. She had earned her name because of the old saying, like a Bab Penny, it keeps coming back. Bab Penny was proud of her name because she always came back. As the ground crew loaded Penny with her cargo, she whispered to Pilot Bob, "Those don't look like bombs." "You're correct, Bab Penny. They are not bombs. It is food, food for the Dutch." Bab Penny had never flown food in her bomb storage area, the Bombay, before. "Can you tell me more about our special mission?" she asked. "The people of the Netherlands are called the Dutch," she explained Pilot Bob. "Several years ago, they were invaded by an enemy army, and all their food has been taken from them to feed to the enemy troops. The people are starving. We will fly very low and drop food near a village so they will be able to eat." In peacetime, the Netherlands is a beautiful country located on the North Sea, and the country is blessed with soil that grows many types of plants. Windmills drop the landscape and fishermen bring their catch to market. The country is best known as the land of tulips. In the spring, thousands of colorful and beautiful tulips bloom all across the land and paint the countryside like a rainbow you can reach out and touch. But now, several years after the Second World War has started, the country is not what it used to be. The Dutch have barely survived the hunger winter of 1944. Tulips cannot bloom because the people are so desperate for food, they are eating the bulbs. The Allied command is talking to the leaders of the enemy army. They know our mission is to drop food, not bombs. They've been told not to shoot at us, but there's no guarantee we will not be attacked. However, we always come back, right, Bab Penny? "Roger," replied Bab Penny. "We always come back." In the Netherlands, a boy named Peter had no idea how his life was about to change. With the food all loaded in the Bombay and her crew all buckled in, Bab Penny was ready to taxi down the runway for takeoff. "We're up and away," yelled Pilot Bob over the roar of the powerful Merlin engines. After crossing the North Sea, the shoreline of the Netherlands began to appear on the horizon. Once over land, Bab Penny would fly very low and then drop her precious cargo. "I have the target in sight," said Bombardier Bill. "His job is to release the food at the correct time so it will fall on the designated target." "Take her in lower," shouted Bombardier Bill. Pilot Bob took Bab Penny as low as she had ever flown before to take off and land. except to take off and land. The fields looked very bare. As Bab Penny flew lower and lower, she thought she could see a child in the field ahead. She flew closer, and indeed, it was a young boy. It was Peter. He was out looking for food. I bet he'll be surprised to see what we dropped from the sky, thought Bab Penny. Food away, yelled Bombardier Bill. Bab Penny was flying so low that Bombardier Bill waved at Peter, and Bab Penny waggled her wings to say hello. Bab Penny thought, I hope that boy can take lots of food back to his home. The food drop was the first of many successful missions Bab Penny and other airplanes flew over the Netherlands as part of Operation Manna. The war would soon be over, and Canadian and Allied forces would be the first friendly armies to enter the Netherlands and free the Dutch. Operation Manna was thought of and carried out by the Allied command, including the armies of Canada and the United States, to help solve the country's serious food shortage. Without Operation Manna, manna meaning food from heaven, many more Dutch citizens would have died. Because of the bravery of these pilots and the freeing of the Netherlands by Canadian and other Allied armies, the Dutch are very grateful to these countries to this day. After the war, Bab Penny was retired from active duty because she had been so busy flying her missions. There had never been an opportunity to dedicate her name and nose art. And nose art is just the little pictures that are painted on the side of airplanes, particularly back during the war years. And they give each plane an identity, and the crews and the ground maintenance people. Everybody just gathers together to service their favorite airplane. So many years later in Windsor, a ceremony was held at the hangar at the airport to dedicate and honor the Bab Penny and officially present the nose art and recognize Bab Penny's name. And a man approached Bab Penny and gently reached out to pat her nose. And he says, my name is Peter. I was the little boy in the field when you flew your first food mission. I've always wanted to meet you and say thank you for being so brave. I am glad you came back, Bab Penny. And Bab Penny smiled widely. I will never forget you, Peter. I waved to you as we flew by. I am so pleased you came to see me on this special day. Every year, as a thank you to all the Canadians for their help during World War II, the Netherlands gives Canada a gift of tulips. Thousands of tulip bulbs arrive in Canada as a thank you to all Canadians for helping the Netherlands during World War II and to keep the friendship between the two countries strong. Ottawa, the capital of Canada, comes alive each spring when thousands of beautiful tulips bloom. Each and every flower is a sign of love from all the Dutch children like Peter. And there's the Operation Manna logo. And that's the end of my presentation. And I guess I can turn it back, or if there's any questions, people can certainly jump in there and see if I can answer anything. But it's been a pleasure to be able to share this with you all. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? Ed?
I don't know if you can see me here or not, but the only comment I make is that like I worked for the city of Windsor almost my entire career, and not that I ate in our cafeteria all that often, but when I did, there's always this older gentleman that would always be sitting by himself, and he was our emergency measures officer who looked after civil defense, and got to know him fairly well. His name was Bob Buckpop. So I had lunch with Bob a number of times, and it was probably about 3-4 years of doing this on and off, and he never said a word about it. He's very mild-mannered, unassuming individual. And one day, another pilot that he was in the war, they sat together, they told the old war stories. And all of a sudden, my eyes are opening up, and I just couldn't believe the stories that Bob would tell about, flying missions, and particularly this Operation Manna. This was an extremely dangerous mission because they flew over German ACAC guns that were waiting on the coast. He said you could read the insignias on the German officers, and the guns were tracking all the way, and they didn't know if they'd fire or not. He says their hearts were in their throat, and they had no way of defending themselves if they started firing. So you're right. This is an amazing story. And I was just very grateful that I got to meet the man that led the raid.
Carlo,
My question is, I'm not sure if you touched upon it or not. Is there a statistic that says how many planes and how many flights? Because I know you said over 10 days, right, till May 5th, but I can't remember the other numbers. If you have any stats.
Well, I know,
on
I'm aware that maybe on the first day, there were about another 250 Lancasters that were all loaded up and did the subsequent food drops that first day. So I really don't have a number on all the other days because of 2 or 3 days later, the United States Army and Air Force started the Operation Chowhound. So they started dropping their own bunch of food supplies. So between the two groups, you know, the United States and I guess the Royal Air Force, there is probably, I don't know, I'm going to guess there's probably close to 1,000 travels back and forth with food and stuff that went on way past May 5th. But I don't really have an exact number. I'll look that up though. A lot though is the answer.
Yeah,
A
that's
lot of
good.
food dropped.
Because you hear this, you don't know how many times it was done. So it's nice to see that it was done that many times.
Yeah, it was done a lot.
any other questions? Anybody on Zoom?
Yeah, I've got a question for Glenn. Glenn, fascinating story, and I'm glad you're the archivist on this. This is absolutely wonderful, and I learned so much new stuff, and I couldn't help but think of the irony. That was 77 years ago, and today we have Russia, you know, invading Ukraine, and what's happening in Mariupol, and one of their strategies is starvation for the people that are in that part of Ukraine. I'm wondering if, to your knowledge, whether there's ever been an operation similar to the one that you talked about.
Well, the only one I'm aware of would be the Berlin airlift back in the late 40s after Berlin, I guess, became a hot spot. But that was not a food drop, but it was flying and landing planes in Berlin, as far as I remember. But other than that, I don't really remember an actual food drop per se.
Right.
But
Okay.
I was been taken too about the similarities between the Ukraine conflict going on now and what was happening back, 70 years ago. It's just unfathomable that we're having to do all this again.
Yeah. Amazing. Good.
Not good.
All right. Any other questions? All right, we'll ask Bruce to come up.
Glenn, on behalf of the club and the members here and on Zoom, thank you so much for sharing the story of the Bad Penny and Operation Manna. And people in the comments, and everybody is right. We're being reminded hourly, if not even more often, of the horrors of war with watching what's going on in Ukraine. And we're reminded through your story this morning of the bravery and courage of people to overcome these things. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right. So once again, next week is Club